The International Monetary Fund is in Nigeria's Federal Capital Territory released its economic outlook on the Sub-Saharan African region. Growth for the region estimated at 4.5% in 2021, but forecast to be slower in 2022 at 3.8%. Headwinds including COVID pandemic, Russia invasion of Ukraine, and elevated debt levels. Also, the IMF is estimating that 6 trillion naira could be spent on fuel subsidies in Nigeria in 2022. Growth in Africa's largest economy is estimated at 3.4% in 2022, while the threat of rising debt could see debt service to revenue reach 100% in 2026. Similar threats to the economy, as listed for the wider Sub-Saharan region, were highlighted. Joining us now from our Abuja studios is Ari Aisen, who is the IMF Resident Representative to Nigeria. Ari, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. If you could, I guess, sum up your outlook on the Sub-Saharan African region in a couple words, would it be cautiously optimistic?
Thank you, Rotus. Thanks, Ari, for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be here. The slowdown in growth that we are projecting this year is because of the second shock after the pandemic. The Russian-Ukraine war has certainly carried very negative effects for the various economies in the region, particularly those who need to import oil. Oil prices are very high, but also those who import commodities, agricultural commodities, like wheat and maize. So incomes are under pressure, inflation is a bit high. Of course, growth is going to still be on a positive side, that's not a contraction, but much slower than last year. So I think that it's a conjunctural difficulty. We were in a recovery process for the region as a whole in 2021 after the pandemic, and then this second shock, the Ukraine crisis, came about, and unfortunately that has derailed a little bit and will put a little bit a hold on the prospects of growth going forward, at least for another couple of years. But the potential of the region is still intact, of course.
All right. Well, if you could weigh the headwinds facing the region, does the Russia invasion of Ukraine carry the most weight, or is it inflation or elevated debt or the low vaccination rates?
Yeah, this is a good question, because some are risks to our baseline and some are actual shocks that already materialized. So, for example, in the case of the Ukraine war, we already know that this has caused an increase in the price of commodities, an increase in fuel prices. So this has materialized and we are living through the consequences. The issue is that because of the pandemic, most of the countries have used the limited fiscal space that they could to support the economies. Now with this second shock, many of the countries already have a debt position that it's too exposed already and too high. So very little room to maneuver the second shock for these economies. As a result, growth suffers and it slows down. So this is the situation we are living at. Of course, the baseline is already challenging. If you add, given the low vaccination rates, potential for another pandemic wave is always there, and it's a risk to the baseline. Let's pray that this doesn't materialize and no new shocks happen to the Sub-Saharan Africa economy, the region as a whole, and individual countries. So for now, we are living under the consequences of this second big shock, which is the Russian war with Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Ari. All right, so coming to Nigeria, the report estimates debt service to revenue could reach 100% in 2026. How does Nigeria turn that around?
You know, first, there are two metrics that are important. One is debt service to revenue of the federal government. Another one is the consolidated government. So things certainly look a little bit more complicated regarding the debt service to revenues of the federal government. And this is the number we are quoting, above 80%, and perhaps, if nothing is done, reaching 100%. The way to reverse this situation is really to mobilize more revenue. The high ratio is a reflection of the low revenue intake, the low revenue collection in Nigeria. Nigeria mobilizes about 7.5% of its GDP in revenues. That is too low, certainly as a share of that service, but also there are other commitments, paying civil servants, doing important social spending, provision of public goods and services. So the country, and as I say, is an existential issue, needs to mobilize more revenues in the years to come. The good news is that the Ministry of Finance has a program in place, and we all need to support that program to raise the revenue to GDP ratio, more revenues for the budget by 2025. It's an ambitious program. It should reach 15% of GDP. We all need to give the support we can to the Ministry of Finance, that with better tax administration, more enforcement, digitalization, and a better incentive for people, simplification for people to pay their dues in terms of taxes, and companies pay their taxes. This is critical for the economy to obtain macroeconomic stability and be able at the same time to enhance the provision of public goods and services.
All right. Now, still on Nigeria's elevated debt levels, what do you make, and you already mentioned revenue, but what do you make of the revenue challenges Nigeria faces, particularly the issue of oil theft?
Yeah, so the governance issue in general is a very important one. We want to be able to maximize the revenues and use the limited revenues, as best as we can. In this case, the oil theft, as it's being documented and discussed, it's a question of really accountability to make sure that this phenomena can actually be tackled seriously, so that the budget and the country doesn't lose important resources that could accrue to the budget and be used for important goods and services. So that's part of the issue. Tax administration, governance, and enhancing and strengthening existing mechanisms to bring more revenue to the budget is now a top priority for Nigeria, as we see it.
Excellent. You've preempted my next question. So is Nigeria's debt level priority number one for the new administration, whoever that is in 2023, in your estimate?
I wouldn't say that this is the top priority, not because it's extended and it's not high enough. First of all, the debt as a share of GDP, and GDP is growing, is now at a moderate level. So Nigeria doesn't suffer solvency issues. It's a very strong economy that still will be able to sustain that level of debt. The debt service that is high as a share of revenue is more a reflection of the low revenue intake and the fact that maybe some of the expenditure, like subsidies that are being deducted from the revenues, in the case of few subsidies, they are actually being, they could actually be dealt with in a different way. That will actually leave more revenues. And in between efforts to raise more revenues and reprioritizing spending out of subsidies and more to other social investments and expenditures, I think Nigeria would see a much better debt picture than it's currently seeing. So I wouldn't say that the debt is the main priority, but I would say that fiscal sustainability, or restoring fiscal sustainability, reducing deficits, should hinge on efforts to mobilize more revenues, not to reduce spending, which is already very low. Nigeria needs to spend more in infrastructure, more in social areas, more in education, more in nutrition, more in health, not less. But for that, you need more revenues. You cannot rely on debt to finance those critical expenditures. And of course, the country as a whole, not only the federal government, the country as a whole, the local governments, the state governments, everyone is accountable to the good use of the resources being accumulated and being raised by the budget.
Great stuff, Ari. I wish we had more time, but very briefly, the report says fuel subsidies could hit 6 trillion naira this year. Do you support a phased withdrawal of subsidies or an immediate withdrawal? Okay, very quickly, if you can.
Yes, the first point is that 500 billion a month, it's what the current rate is. It depends on oil prices. So 6 billion is just an extrapolation of the 500 billion that it's being paid every month. How to resolve this? The first thing is to be able to compensate the most vulnerable that will be affected by this elimination of the fuel subsidies. So being able to recognize who they are and being able to compensate somehow, as it was the plan by the Ministry of Finance, with support certainly of the IMF and others. So that is critical. So either if you do gradually or in one go, what the critical aspect is that this is done in consensus, that everyone in society agrees that this is a critical thing to do to restore fiscal sustainability and compensate the most vulnerable while we do that, creating the right mechanisms to transfer funds that will compensate the losses of these most vulnerable. But the subsidies are regressive. They are actually benefiting more the rich than they benefit the poor. So we need to, in our view, fix that situation and invest more in areas that the poor could benefit more.
Ari Aisen, IMF representative for Nigeria, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us on the Global Business Report.